Hi everyone, my name is Meng. I'm from DesignCode, and today we're going to cover a very big topic about UI design. It's going to be about colors, about grids, and about adaptive layout. And colors seems to be a very small topic, but it's something that takes a lot of time to actually master. So let me just go to Figma, and this is where we are right now. And remember last time during the live stream, we sort of like started together with a design that I barely spent 2 hours on. This is basically another day, and I've been playing a little bit with concepts. It's kind of cool to be able to design with you, and you can see the progress with me if you've been one of those who have followed in the audience since last time. And it's good. It's good to be part of sort of like a progress and to sort of design with someone who is who has the same level of passion as you have, hopefully. And there's definitely a lot of things to cover in terms of UI design. But today I want to just focus and put more thought into the colors aspect of things. So a lot of people are probably asking, how do I select colors? And, what is the inspiration to get from, a blank screen to something that is more fleshed out? Especially I think as I design, my opinions tend to change a little bit, and I sleep on it and then I come back to it, and it feels a little bit different. So colors have a lot of impact on your mood. It has a lot of impact on your ability to see the progress of your design, your ability to set the environment for your design, to inspire people, and yeah, hopefully to bring some happiness and vibrancy into people's lives. So first of all, let's talk about the basics of colors. I do have a course about colors, and it's a bit old, but it's definitely still very relevant. It's on DesignCode.io, and here, I'm just gonna cover the basics for now. For example, we're gonna start with the primary, secondary, and tertiary. So you have red, blue, and yellow, and then all the in between are the secondary colors. And I think it's good to sort of like stay consistent. So if you're picking, let's say, red here, it's good to have a color that is next to it, in the same sort of the same angle, the same saturation, the same brightness, perhaps. And to be able to pair them together is definitely something that takes quite a bit of practice. And then it is important to look at the colors for different platform. If you're designing for the web, it's kind of free for all, because the web doesn't have such a strict standard, such a fleshed out design language set by the platform. The web has started, over 3 decades ago, and it started with a very clean slate, very few standards at the time. And suddenly, so many people are designing, so many tools came out. And so the web doesn't have a lot of like specific color palettes. But if you look at iOS, this is what usually Apple use when they use red. And of course, you don't have to use this. This is just to give you a standard, to give you a base to work from. And I would say that if you're designing for Android, so if you go to material.io, it's a little bit stricter, because Android is very heavily based on colors, and the app seems to be a lot more uniform. So if you're talking about colors on Android, it's extremely important, and they have their own concepts about it. So material design, let's say, let me just go to their documentation. I'm gonna go to color. So they have a color system, and usually you're gonna pick one of these colors, and then they're gonna suggest different colors to go with it to complement it. in terms of from the navigation to the tab bar to the action button and so on and so forth. So Android is more stricter. So if you have like a spectrum, iOS would be in the middle, Android would be like very strict in terms of colors, and then the web is basically free for all. So that's kind of like about the platforms, and we're gonna get into the color palette. But first of all, let's talk about some of the naming of when we talk about color. So we have the hue, which is sort of like this color wheel here from red to yellow and green, blue. The saturation, which is how vibrant it is. So the more saturation we have, the more vibrant the color becomes. And then the brightness is kind of like from dark to light. And it's really important to be familiar with these terms when you design. And it's also important to be able to complement the colors. Let's say you're picking a main color that is blue, then it's important to be able to play with the brightness. So using, let's say, a white layer on top of it, and then you get like suddenly another color, or a black layer on top of it, then you get a slightly darker color. So that's kind of like called a monochrome color. Analogous. We're not going to get too much into the theory of things. I'm not a person who really likes to bore people with a ton of theory without practice. So we're going to get straight into it. First of all, let's talk about some of the key resources to find a color palette. It's important to start with a color palette, and the color palette can stem from the content itself. So for example, you could have a photo or a logo or an icon that is already fleshed out, and you would take the colors from those elements. So for example, in my design, some of these colors were already used in the past, and I know for a fact that in DesignCode we use a little bit of the purple, and we've been using some of these colors in our previous landing pages. So I'm kind of like trying to bring some of the same foundation, so that it doesn't feel like a completely different site. And I try to make it evolve rather than start from a blank slate. I don't like to design just for design's sake. I like to design from an improvement perspective. So one of the good, if you have to start from a blank slate, that's totally fine. And let's say you don't have a logo, let's say you don't have any picture or any content to work from. First of all, go and get some inspiration for sure. Like go on Dribbble and search for some really cool inspiration, and look at some of the colors. It doesn't have to be a very specific design. It can be just about the color. So for example, I click on this one. Maybe I don't necessarily like the design. Maybe I don't necessarily think it's something that I want to use, but I can like this from a color perspective. So I could say, well, I kind of think that this blue here goes well with the pink, and there's a complementary a slightly darker pink, and maybe you can use white and black as neutral tones to complement everything, and then you have basically an app as a whole. So yeah, take some time to browse for inspiration. This is your source, this is your energy, this is your sun, and that's how I design. That's how I start. I like to look at designs that I like, at designs that I already started. And let's say there could be an app. It doesn't have to be a UI from Dribbble. It could be like an app that someone is making that you admire, or an app on iOS, on Android that you really, really love. And so you could sort of take the inspiration and the motivation from that, either from a color perspective, from a content perspective, and so on. But yeah, if you do need to have these color palettes, there's a really good tool called coolers.co, and you can explore some of the training palettes. They're gonna generate a bunch of them. One thing that you need to sort of like understand is kind of like figure out what is the theme of your of your design? Like, are you going more for the traditional sort of like antique, how do you say? I'm trying to find the word, but something from the past, from the old 1980s. Then you could look at colors like this, or are you looking for something a little bit more vibrant and modern, iOS and Android? Then you would look at a color palette like this. I think it's also cool to sort of like put colors together in a rainbow way, because the rainbow, as you know, is a beautiful sort of like color palette, one next to each other, and it brings this kind of liveliness to it. In fact, like the original Apple logo was using this color palette or a similar version of it. And so this is a good starting point. You don't have to pick all of them. I would select one or two of these colors. Start, let's say, from the purple or the red or the blue. Definitely the blue is one of the most popular ones. It's a safe one. And I think lately purple works really well, especially purple with deep blue, because the contrast ratio with the white is so good. If you look at the design here, I'm able to put black, or I'm able to put white, and it still is pretty readable. Now, I would say that, you have to kind of tweak. It's not a black and white answer. Sometimes you have to make the purple a little bit lighter against the black, or a little bit darker against the white. So this is there are tools out there such as plugins on Figma, where you're going to be able to judge the contrast ratio for accessibility. And so whenever you pick colors and you match it against a background, for example, it is important to look at the contrast ratio in terms of making your design more accessible. So yeah, inspiration, colors. So if you look at this design, this started from the landing page called, for build an app for SwiftUI. And I wanted to reuse some of these of these colors that I've been using. We also design some emails, and every time I try to sort of like advance the design a little bit. So, if I'm going to browse in my Figma files, I'm gonna go to emails, and we send some updates to our users once a month. We try not to spam them. And this is kind of like a history of all the emails that we have sent over the past. And lately we've been sending a lot about SwiftUI, because we're very, very passionate about SwiftUI. I love it. It's a lot of fun. A lot of designers should be using it. And so I've been kind of toying around with this blob thing, and it's very easy to do by using the vector tool in Figma. And so I wanted to sort of like reuse some of this and some of these colors to bring back some of that design language for DesignCode 4. For those who haven't followed, we are designing a new version of DesignCode, hopefully with better features, with an updated design, more modern, easy to use, and so on. So that's the goal for this design that we're doing right now. And this is where I took the colors. Now, when you're designing and when you have your color palette, okay, the question is, how do you use it? How do you create complementary colors? How do you create contrasting colors, neutral tones, and so on? So first of all, the background, I would say, can be off-white or white. So right now I'm using a very off-white. And the reason why I'm doing this is because it can allow me to set another level of elevation on top of it. So for example, if I have a rectangle that is white, well, this rectangle can sort of have a separation from the background, right? So I'm not saying you have to do this. I'm just saying this is the reason why I'm setting an off-white background. And so when you have a sort of like depth of different layers, you have more flexibility in terms of how you can approach your design, how you can divide your design better. And on top of that, you can use shadows and rounded corners to set some of these elevations. So for example, one thing I like to use is like 40 and about 20, so half the number for Y position, half of the blur. And I would set like to 15% opacity. And you don't have to use black, for example. You could be using the color itself. You can use, let's say, purple, but don't make it too vibrant, because colors shouldn't be too vibrant unless it has to be natural. Let's say we are in the digital age nowadays, so a lot of times when you have a very vibrant card or a screen, like a phone, for example, well, the shadow or the glow, if you want to call it a glow, can be sort of the color that comes from the screen, and that's kind of like the inspiration for these colored drop shadow. I kind of like to call them contextual shadow. So for example, if you have a card that is purple, well, to make it more interesting than just to set a drop shadow of black, which is, let's say 30% black, it kind of looks, a little bit off. Because if you look at real life, you look at objects on your table right now, and you look at different lighting coming from different sources, you're gonna realize that your drop shadow of your objects are not 100% just black, right? Like it's very contextual to whatever objects or lighting that you have in your room. So what I'm trying to say here is that you can also be contextual in your design as a result. So for example, instead of setting a black drop shadow, you can be setting the same color as your card, and then you can set the transparency to about 30%. So now you kind of have this glow / drop shadow that makes it far more interesting, far more vibrant than if it was just black. The same for this little button here. You can see that the drop shadow is not black. So if I was to set black, especially with more opacity, it tends to look more and more off the more you see the blackness. But if you set it to a dark, a dark purple, you can see that it feels more vibrant, it feels more lifelike. And that's kind of like why a lot of designers nowadays are starting to use contextual shadows rather than just black drop shadows. So that's one way to play with your colors. You have your main color, let's say it's purple, and then you would sort of like set. So let's say we're trying to design this card right here, right? First of all, when you're using colors, make sure that you're using colors to deviate the attention to the right thing. So for example, for a button, for a piece of content, for something that is clickable. So, that's good. And also for the branding, like it sets a tone for those things. So, but at the same time, if your content is not as important, such as some of these secondary cards, so this card might not be as important as, let's say, the hero section, which to me is far more important. At the end of the day, what I wanted to do with the hero section was like, when people land here, I just want to, on the first glance, I want to make them happy. I want to kind of get them to say, wow, like this is a brand, this is a language, this gets me going, this gives me energy to browse more and scroll more. And that's kind of like the goal for me when I set this hero space. It doesn't have to be colors. It can be a mock-up, it can be like a preview of your app, it can be a video, whatever it is. The hero is the space where you're like, this is your first impression. This is your first shot at getting the attention from your audience so that they get excited about your product. And, once you get that attention, then we can get into the more, neutral tones, right? So here, so some people are saying I'm talking too much. I just want to point out that this is a live stream, and my son is here. And I'm trying to explain as much as I can. Hopefully some of you enjoyed. If you don't enjoy it, please just tell me, and I'm gonna just move on to the next topic. But yeah, talking about the neutral tone, it's very important to to not just use colors everywhere. You're not just gonna go into colors and then vibrant colors more and vibrant colors more. Like you want to get them a break, and that's why we would have neutral tones. So you would have like a background here, which let's say you have this purple. Instead of using a giant purple card, then you would go into a more neutral tone. So I'm gonna move my color wheel here, and I would go into a more neutral colors that is very contextual, right? So you can see that from that purple color I can move a little bit, and then now I get a more neutral color. And yeah, sorry, I'm getting a bit distracted right now. So yeah, like also make sure that you're able to play with your main colors, right? Don't just go with one full vibrant color and then not have a neutral tone. So if we look at the color that I have, we have the light one, which is the off-white, and then we also have the darker one, which is what I use here in the outline of my icon. So I'm gonna zoom in a little bit. You're gonna find here, this is the outline of the icon. This is a slightly darker one, and also we have the darker version for these background for the icon here. So once you have your colors, you will want to add them to your color palette, and in Figma you can set that color palette so that you can reuse those colors easily. So what I'm gonna do here, I'm going to select those colors. So the first one is let's say the main color. I'm gonna use let's say this blue is my main color. I'm gonna click on it, and then I'm gonna go to this little these dots here that is called style, and then I'm going to add this color to my color palette. So this would be like primary, let's say, and then from that color I can have a complementary color, such as, let's say, the purple here. So I'm gonna add this one as well, and 2 is enough. You don't need more than that, okay? Especially if you're starting out with colors, I would suggest 1 or 2. And then you need neutral tones. So you have definitely the background, which is very important to use for every single background. If you're not using white, of course. I don't really count white and black, but you could definitely count them, but they're so easy to kind of pick that is totally unnecessary to add that to your color palette. And so yeah, I'm gonna add the background color and 1 elevation, so 1 neutral tone, which would be the background here. Not sure why I'm not getting the background, but let's say I'm gonna use this color, and I'm going to add that as, let's say, neutral light, and then I need a neutral dark, which is this one. So dark blue. So of course I'm just improvising, but at the end of the day you roughly need about 5 colors. So you would have primary, secondary, you have sort of like the background color if it's not white. If it's white, then you don't need this 3rd color, and then you need sort of like the neutral light and then the neutral dark. So that's what I would go for if I was to start with a color palette. And from that color palette, you're gonna be able to expand and create as many pages as you want. And it doesn't also mean that you're restricted by these color palettes. So for example, one thing that I went for is following the content. Sometimes the content can have its own colors. And more as designers, because of the power of tools and the power of code, we are able to not just restrict ourselves with just a few colors. Nowadays, we can use script to auto detect different colors in our background. So you can look at iTunes, for example. They do a very good job at, let's say, automating some of these colors, and they used to have a version in which they would like detect some of these colors. I don't know if it's there anymore. And on top of that, you also have the contextual drop shadow that is based on the cover itself. So you can see that this glow here is taken from the image. Now, my point is, because code and scripts have become so sophisticated, you don't have to necessarily always use your primary and neutral colors. You can also sometimes become more contextual, such as in this case, I can have like a color for each artwork depending on the course, and then I can sort of like decide that, oh, maybe I want to use the red from this background as a complementary color, and just play with that. And so I can do something like this, and now I have something very interesting. So I just want to point out this, that you don't have to be restricted to those colors, because there are rules, and then there are ways to break those rules to make your design more interesting. Otherwise, it feels too monotone, right? So that's why I went for some of these colors. So I want the color to express the course itself. So for example, UI design could be purple, and React for designers could be yellow or beige or orange, and SwiftUI could be blue. And so when you have this sort of language that you have, as long as you are consistent in the way that you design your UI, then you can make it make sense for your design. So that's it about colors, I think. Now we can talk about grid. Of course, I'm sure there are stuff that I may have forgotten. But yes, someone asked about how did I came with these gradients, right? Like, a lot of these gradients can be done on the fly, and they're very easy to do. So for example, let me just duplicate this one, right? So I don't have to use this one. I would go to the linear gradient, and then I would let's say find any of these colors that I already use, called document colors. So I can play with, let's say, orange, and then I just need to make sure that the secondary color works well with orange. So for example, if I said white, it might not work well because of some of these elements on top, but I could say, let's say, a complementary color like this one, or I can move the color wheel next to it. So it doesn't have to be here or here, as long as it fits. Sorry. This is the weekend for me, and I'm trying to kind of like find time in the weekend to be able to stream this, but we all work from home, and sometimes we do fail at these things. So yeah, I just want to say, whenever you pick colors, try to pick a color next to it. So for example, I started with orange, so I'm gonna play with yellow. I could play with pink, I could play with red, and it works really well. As you can see, as long as I'm still respecting the contrast of the content that is on top of it, and you can essentially do a fairly good job at playing with some of these colors. It takes practice. I'm not saying that it's easy all the time, but it takes some practice. It's but it's good to try. You know, it's good to try for yourself instead of just fitting in with one of these color palettes that are trendy and that may not fit with the design that you're going for. It's good to have the flexibility to try different things. And so, for example, here I tried different colors as well. You know, let's just try another one. I'm gonna duplicate again because I don't like to lose the colors that I really like. So, you know, I'm just gonna play with another one. Let's go with, you know, purple works really well. Like I said, it has a very good contrast with the content. Blue works really well as well, and blue tends to work well with a lot of colors out there. And yeah, you know, let's say one end is blue, another end could be maybe green. Since I don't have green in my color palette here, I'm going to move a little bit from, so here. So this is a really good color as well, as long as I have good contrast as well against the white of the text, but otherwise I would have to change the text to black instead, or dark purple. And on top of that, I have to make sure that whatever elements that I'm playing with it, such as these dotted lines, you know, that they also match with the new color that I just set up. And so you can see that instead of orange, I can go for, you know, purple or you know, or other colors. But yeah, you know, like have fun with it. It's very, very easy. A lot of people are scared of colors, but honestly, just have fun with it. It comes with time. You know, sleep on it. If you hate it at first, sleep on it. Come back tomorrow. Take photography. Go into nature. Nature is the best teacher for colors. And then come back to your design, and you're gonna be able to judge. Design relies a lot on your ability to have taste, you know, like to develop your taste. Just like when you're cooking, you know, it's very important to have good taste, you know, to have a good judge of the level of salt, the level of sourness, and all of these things. It comes with practice. So, you know, try to yeah, take photography, anything that really helps you with colors, and it's going to develop your taste, and your taste is going to allow you to design better, and not from a technical standpoint, but from a judgment standpoint, which is equally important when it comes to UI design. So that's how I came up with the colors in the blobs. How did I create the blur inside the shape? So this is extremely easy to do. One thing that I love about iOS is that they have these techniques about shadows, and it's very flexible, but also about what they call now is material sheet. We like to call it background blur. And basically what you need to do is to set the background either white or dark, and it can be also a color background, but let's start with black. You need to set the opacity to, let's say, 80% or maybe 60%, depending on the contrast that you need for the content. And then make sure that this opacity is set on the fill color and not on the actual element itself, such as the layer, because the background blur is not going to work. And then you go to effect, and you would set the effect to background blur instead, and set the blur to the level of blur that you want. So for example, you can set it to 40 instead, and now you have this background blur. And so you can make it more contextual, like I did here. I use sort of like the same color as the front element, or the primary color that I'm using. So for example, this one I'm using slightly more purple, and this one is slightly more orange. And yeah, you know, like play with with those colors, you know, until it feels great for your app, right? But this is essentially the technique that I'm using for these blurred cards. Now, back to the design. We're gonna talk about grid. I think grid is extremely important nowadays. It's very important to design for multiple devices, for different resolutions, for adaptiveness of your UI. The browser needs to be able to resize very easily. So one thing I would say is that you don't need to be extremely strict but you can be. So for example, you can go to your artboard and you can set something called the layout grid. So the layout grid, what is popular right now, you know, a lot of designers are, you know, adamant about the 4-point grid or the 8-point grid or the 12-point grid. Personally, I'm not. Maybe that's because I've been designing for a long time, but also because as a coder myself, the grid, you know, is not relevant when you're coding. So I never see, you know, setting grid in code. I don't do that. So what I do in code is setting padding. I set margins, I set, you know, I set centering, alignments, and all these things. That's why I'm not super passionate about 4-point grids and 8-point grids, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't respect it. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it, especially if you're starting out. So, you know, in Figma, you can set a 4-point grid or 8-point grid, which is probably the most popular right now. And essentially what you want to do is you want to set the baseline or these card alignment to fit into the lines of the grid. So that is essentially the goal. And like this, by doing this, you're setting a minimum spacing between the elements that is often necessary to make your design breathe more. So if a lot of common mistakes that I see designers make is, especially when they're starting out, they don't set enough spacing. They're gonna set it something like this, and it doesn't breathe enough, and it feels very cluttered and condensed, and you know, it works for some UI, but it does not work for some other UI. What I mean by that is that if you're designing a design tool, for example, you know, you're designing Figma, you can see that it's very dense. The information has to be very dense. All the options has to be available in the minimum amount of space possible. Now, if you're browsing a landing page, as you know, in contrast, that's different. So for example, Apple, you know, you go to, you know, the iPhone page. Well, it does not have to have such information density, right? You can have so much more spacing to do your presentation and to make it breathe, to focus on the right areas for the eyes. As you know, the eyes read from left to right, top to bottom. You need to make sure that you're following some of those rules and understand how your users, how people use your app, right? And so those are two different approaches to UI design. It's not because the spacing for one side, for one tool, is done in such a way that it needs to be applied exactly for another design. And there are definitely two types. One is for, you know, like the design tools and apps that are more tool centered, and then there's the presentation apps such as you know, landing pages. So that's kind of the difference. Also, if you're designing for mobile, it can also be very different. Yeah, you know, these are some of the things, but usually there's two categories. One is more for presentation, the other one is more for usability. And sometimes there's a mix of the two, right? Sometimes you have the Twitter apps, the sign up page can have way more spacing, and then sometimes you go into, let's say, the editor, then it's a lot more dense, you know, like you just need to figure out like which one of these approaches have to fit what. So anyways, the grids, essentially what you want to do is the baseline to fit these grids, and you can see the baseline of this text has to land straight on the red line, and you need to make sure that when you set the line height, that the next text baseline is going to fit on that red line here. So that kind of allows you to know, without necessarily having years of experience, of guts, you know, to be able to respect some of these rules. So for example, I can say, okay, well, if I want to have more spacing, then okay, so the next one would be 10, or the previous one could be 2. And like this, it works pretty nice. I just noticed that I actually set it the line height here, and then I have the paragraph spacing. It's not correct, sorry. I set it to 150%. So by the way, if you don't know some of these rules about typography, usually it's between 125% to 150%. But if you want to be more precise, you can use the pixel numbers, and yeah, we can set, let's say, make sure that it lands on the baseline. It's not always perfect. Yeah, it's not perfect. But there are different ways to do it. So that's about layout grid. I would say layout grid is very relevant, is more so relevant for iOS because you have less space, and so you can definitely play with that. But I'm not passionate about it, so I'm gonna move on to the next topic. Let me just click on this one. And what I'm more passionate about is the consistency and spacing, but more importantly, the breakpoints and setting the rulers. So what we're gonna do is click on Shift and R, and then here we're gonna set some of these rulers for our app. Now, when I start a design for web, I like to start at the resolution of desktop, and that resolution happens to be 1440 by 1024. And this is a good resolution because it fits the iPad. It also fits the desktop screens, for example, the iMac, the MacBook Pro, and computers in general. And then, so this is a good starting point. And the reason why I'm not setting it to, let's say, 1024, which is a very popular resolution, or I don't remember all the numbers, but yeah, 1024 is a very popular one, is because when you design, you wanna have some space in the left and right to be flexible enough. So for example, here when I design, I'm not designing to a point where I'm gonna use from this space to the other end of the space. I need some spacing on the left and right to set space for the background, for some of the animations. So for example, one thing I could do is have these dotted lines animated, kind of like moving in a linear fashion against the shape of the blob. And so that could be an interesting thing that happens in the background. It makes your design more lively. It makes people excited to scroll down. And so, that's why I would design with a resolution of 1440 and not necessarily like 1024. But that being said, I'm setting those breakpoints though, so that I have a sense of like, okay, well, I need to make sure that my content fits within these breakpoints and how it's going to look like within these breakpoints. So one thing that I like to do is to have, let's say, a 1024 breakpoint. So you can see here, I'm setting a width of 1024, and from that width, I'm setting a line so that it lands directly from the start to the end, and make sure that this rectangle here is centered so that you can center your content. When you design, especially for a landing page like this, try to center as much as you can, and try to use as much space as you can, so that you don't end up with a design that looks like this one. I think it would be very boring to have a design that looks like this, for example, where we have like a ton of empty space on the left and a ton of empty space on the right. Instead, we should be using as all the real estate necessary. We don't want our users to scroll endlessly for content that could be shown on a bigger screen in a larger format, right? So I think that's kind of like the goal, especially if you look at the designs that you find on on Apple, especially for the iPhone 11 Pro. They have some really cool techniques. So at some point, they're gonna split this into a grid. So here they're using the full space, left, middle, and right on a bigger screen. But when you resize it, suddenly the grids become, left, right, and then the third one goes to the bottom. So a lot of designers who starts with a mobile resolution, they're probably gonna start with this, with this layout here, and they kind of forget that it can scale up and the screen can become much larger, and throughout the entire interface, it's just gonna use the same layout. And it's fine. I'm not saying it's the wrong approach. It's definitely a different approach. But what I like to do is I like to start with the desktop first, because I want to know how much space that I can use, and then from that amount of space, then I can just like set, drill it down and make it more digestible in a smaller screen. And again, this is entirely your choice. Some people are very adamant about this approach, and some other people are more adamant about using a bigger screen. But at the end of the day, one factor comes into mind, which is, what is your main audience, right? Who are the people who use your apps the most? Is it the people using mobile first, or is it the people using desktop first? And that answer for me is desktop, which is why I would start desktop first. And if that answer was to be mobile, so let's say I'm creating Instagram, for example, or Instagram's clone, then I would definitely design probably mobile first, because that's kind of like the bulk of my audience. And that's to approach, and that's how I would approach it. So next, let's look at the other breakpoints. There's the 960. A lot of people know this by the 960 grid, yeah, it's good, but it's not as relevant anymore, because with the CSS tools that we have nowadays, with SwiftUI and all of these implementations, we don't have to be static as much as we used to be. So back in the day, we don't want to make our design too adaptive, because it's a lot of work. So for example, when you have a card like this, you don't really want to change the size of that card ever. So because of that, we had the 960 grid, and we had a bunch of grids, 1, 2, 3, and then you want to make sure that the size of your card fits within that grid. Well, we don't need to do that anymore, because at the end of the day, your card can be either bigger or smaller. And it's very easy to do that in CSS. And because of the ease of doing that, then we don't need to follow those grids anymore. We can be a lot more flexible, okay? And I'm not sure if actually Dribble does that, but a lot of website does that. So for example, these, you can see the grid doesn't apply anymore, because when I resize my screen, the thumbnails, they resize as well. Okay, and it's not like a static anymore. It's not pixel based. It's kind of ratio based instead. So scripting, CSS, and layout has become more sophisticated, and because of that, you don't need to follow all of these super strict rules unless you choose to, unless you want to, unless it makes you feel comfortable doing that. But for me, I just like the idea of freedom in my design. I like to be able to just play with as much as I want, and just to push the envelope and to animate things crazy stuff. So the next one would be 768, and that reason is very simple. It's for the iPad in portrait mode. So at the end of the day, like I said, I want to make sure that my design fits, the bigger screen, 1024, 768, and then I will definitely create another UI for the mobile resolution, which would be 640, and then 320, which is the minimum size, the older generation of the iPhone SE. But also for slide over and split screen in iPad, they use that resolution. So as a result, we need to make sure that we respect and can accommodate a lot of these very, very old devices that people still use. So speaking of crazy ideas, yeah, I've been playing around with some of these UIs. So for example, this is something that we can cover in a new session. For example, we can talk about how we can plan some of these animations. I think I did set up a page for this one. I had, Figma has this prototyping tool that allows you to quickly set up, the hover state quite easily. This takes like a minute to do so. And it requires you to just duplicate your artboard and setting the connection from one artboard to another, so that you see from this state to this state. And if I set it to, let's say, completely visible, then I can see that I align things in this way so that it transitions to this state after. And like I said, this takes a minute to do. It's super simple. Like, I can definitely cover this in a next session if this happens to be a popular thing that people wants to see, these live streams. If not, that's fine. I can go back to just like teaching and recording courses. So hopefully you enjoyed. What else I can talk about? Yes, we can talk about adaptive layout a little bit, but more importantly, I want to talk about auto layout in Figma. This is a fairly new technique in Figma, and I suggest that every designer start using it as much as possible, because it is it's so relevant to the way that we code in CSS, to the way that we code in SwiftUI. What I mean by that, you're gonna see that every single of these elements are using auto layout. So for example, if I was to change the text and I want to say I'm adding another line of text, boom, you see that, oh my god, my whole UI is responding to that. Like this is centering, my this is centering as well, and my design doesn't look broken. So yeah, like set as much as possible these auto layout, and it makes your designing so much more enjoyable to edit. Like oftentimes as a designer, you're gonna change the copy all the time. Sometimes you're gonna see like at first I was like putting what was don't just learn code, and then I thought, well, maybe this can be a bit offensive to coders, and they're like, yeah, okay, let's just say don't skip design. So that's why I changed the text. And as you can see, using auto layout is so easy to do that. And yeah, try to set auto layout as much as you can. You can see that I have it here. So if I set another point, then it add automatically, and I can center it afterwards. I could also have set auto layout everywhere, but in this case, because of the shape, auto layout is not perfect. Sometimes you're gonna have like backgrounds. Sometimes you're gonna have like layers on top of your background that can be in the way of your auto layout. But if that's not the case, you can always set it auto layout in a children element. So for example, this shape here does not have auto layout, but the list of features or benefits do have auto layout. And what is cool about auto layout is that it's super flexible. So for example, if I was to bring like another icon, I can just drag and drop that icon, and boom, like it fits for me. And all I need to do is just change that icon later on and change the color. I didn't have to reposition everything after that. Life is beautiful, right? That's kind of like the goal of of using auto layout, to make all of these changes, to make your creativity run free, and be able to just not have to deal with realigning every single element all the time. It's just like a lot of it's a pain in the butt. So that's auto layout. For those who don't know how to set up auto layout, let me just do a very quick one. So let's say we have a title, and then I'm going to duplicate this, and I'm going to set a description. So obviously you don't want to have the same style for both. So I'm going to set this one smaller, and the title is going to be bigger. So now you have your spacing. As I mentioned before, for me, it's much more important to do padding or margins versus layout grid. The reason why is because in code, it's very easy to say, okay, the spacing between these two elements is 10. Developers, they understand that. And that's it. Like once you have these two elements, you select them and you go to auto layout on the right side, click on plus, boom, the auto layout is set automatically for you. So now, as a result, if you set a new line, it's gonna set the adaptiveness for you. So afterwards, you can say, okay, this element I want it to align to the left, and this element to be aligned to the right or the middle or the left. And if you want to set nested auto layout, you can say, okay, I'm gonna bring a new icon. So let's say this barbecue one, okay? And basically what I want to do is to center it against this element. So now if you're gonna see the auto layout again, click on it, you can set the spacing. It's exactly like CSS grid. You can set the vertical padding or the horizontal padding. You can set it if it's vertical or horizontal. And so, let's say I'm gonna set it to 30 or 20. And if let's say I want to make this icon to be centered instead, I can do so. So like this, the next time that I need to change something, a title, the content, the icon, I can just drag and drop that to here and delete this one. It should have kept the alignment, but I mean, depending on how you set up your auto layout, but yeah, it saves a ton of time dealing with adaptive layout. All right, so this is pretty much the end of this session. I hope you enjoyed it. Another thing I want to say is that at the end, I will answer some of the questions that you have. So for example, I'm going to go through some of those questions. This one, any tips on landing a remote job? There's a huge competition. How shall one stand out from the crowd? Okay, so this is a good question. As you know, a lot of people are working from home, and we have to get used to this new normal. And I think it's good to invest in the ability to work remotely. It's good to invest in learning design, learning code, learning marketing, learning anything that has to deal with working on a computer. Not only is it good for the prospect of a job, but also it's good for the prospect of creating your business, your side projects, your whatever you want to do. There's so many ways to make a living by working on your computer. So the question is, how do you land a job in a remote work? Well, first of all, it's important to look at the T-shape. The T-shape is when you have one specialty, and then you can expand to other ones that complement the main specialty, right? What is your main specialty? What do you want to do in your life? Is it UI design? Is it code? Is it I would say don't necessarily chase for the money, because money is just a result of your creativity, your work, your masterpieces. And just settle for something that you're really passionate about, okay? So find something that you love. In my case, I love design. But design for me is extremely broad. It's not just like, moving pixels or um, you know, for me is the whole spectrum, the whole idea of launching a product from the ground up. It's not just about working in Figma. It's not just about creating, a bunch of shapes or backgrounds. It's also about coding and submitting my app to the Apple Store and making a business out of it and teaching people. And so I'm not saying you have to do all of that stuff. I think you should always start like a T-shape. So you start with one specialty. It could be typography. It could be as detailed as being good with icons. It can be as detailed as being good with illustrations. Eventually, when you're good, you're gonna get really, really, really good. And this might take a long time. It's not something that's gonna happen overnight. It's like asking to be a doctor and just like suddenly you're operating on someone. That's not gonna happen. Nobody's gonna want you to operate on them after a week of learning how to do that. Design is the same thing, or anything in life, right? Like anything you want to be good at, it should not be a quick scheme. Expect this to take 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it takes. But the question is, how do you strategize in a way that you can stay motivated the whole way through? And that's what a lot of people struggle with. They have so many ideas. They're like, oh my God, I want to be a coder. I want to be a designer. I want to be, a business person. I want to build my own app. And, and then suddenly we tell them, well, you have to design your app now and you have to code it. You have to learn SwiftUI. You have to learn Android. And they're like, what? And that's the thing, and that's the problem. They lose motivation. They don't know how. They haven't really planned and sort of created a roadmap for how they're gonna reach there. So what I would say is that start with something that you're really good at. You always have something that you're good at. Okay, just figure it out. It can be drawing. It can be speaking. It can be I don't know, finding resources, can be hiring, whatever it is that you're good at. Start with that, find a job, and then from that branch out, and work at a company and just make sure that that company is open-minded about you trying new things, such as design, such as code. If you're a developer, that company can be called Design Plus Code. And here at Design Plus Code, we actually encourage our developers to design. So that's good. Then within an environment like that, you can grow, you can branch out, you can become better, and eventually, if you don't feel the passion anymore for, let's say, marketing, let's say you started in marketing and you don't feel passionate, or you started in support, customer support. A lot of people do that. It's very easy. It's probably, I'm not saying, I don't know the state of the market, but it's probably very easy to start with something like customer support or, community manager or Instagrammer, whatever it is. No offense. Start with that, and from there, just branch out. You can be a YouTuber, for example. A YouTuber does a lot of things: video editing, design. They have to design their own cover. They have to speak in front of a microphone. So, from there, you're going to find passion with practice, take courses, go to my live stream, and then, learn from that. Eventually, you're going to get really, really good, in 6 months' time, in 1 year's time. And at that point, build your portfolio. That should be your main priority. Build your portfolio, put your work out there, tweet, get feedback from a lot of people, and eventually you're going to be able to get so good, to have such a strong portfolio that companies will beg to hire you. So that's how I would do it. And it takes time. I've been doing this for 20 years. And I started as a designer. Now I can code. Now I can teach code as well. But it didn't start that way. And I did find my passion because I'm able to do a bunch of things that I love to do, because I do, get tired eventually of one thing, of just doing the same thing over and over. So that's me, and it's not everyone, but that's kind of like my path. Sorry for the long-winded answer. Hopefully that was useful. So Yes, so we did talk about the color choices and we did talk about the blur. I'm gonna scroll down the other comments to make sure that I'm not missing anything. So someone asking about can I convert this live stream into SwiftUI or this design perhaps? Yes, I would love to do that. But first of all, I need to adapt this design for iOS. And once I do that, then I'm gonna be able to do everything in SwiftUI. So next question. How much of a font size in a bar or a rectangle to be? Well, it depends on the size of your rectangle. Yeah, I would look at the iOS guidelines, the magic number 44 and the body text if it's a button. So for example, if you look at some of these, this button here is using a 17 text. This is a very good size for the text in the button because it's not a title. And a text in the button is considered body text. There's the smaller text. If it's a small button, it would be more like 15 or 13. And if it's a giant button, I would say try to avoid the giant button unless it's the main point of action like this one. But sometimes you can get away with like having multiple lines of text piled up like this. So when an icon on the left side, title and secondary text, then you can have something like this. So that is about sizes. Okay. What do I think about constraints? Okay, that's a very good question. So we're moving away more and more from constraints. First of all, constraints are extremely hard to use. Okay, if you work with storyboard, if you work with sketch constraints or Figma constraints, it's good at first, but it gets very, very hard to maintain. Okay, and that's why and by the way, CSS don't use constraints, and I'm glad that's the case because constraints is something that have existed since storyboard. When I mean storyboard is like interface builder, and unfortunately a lot of people just struggle with storyboard. And more so now designers are struggling with constraints because it's commonplace now in design tools, right? Like Sketch, Figma, and all of these design tools are using constraints as well. Now it becomes harder and harder when you set the amount of pixels from the left, from the top, from the right, from the bottom, because it's hard to maintain, right? Instead, you should be using auto layout as much as you can, and using the grids and the layout guides, the rulers, so that you align things correctly, and the padding. So this is much easier to manage, and you can see here. Let me take this as an example. If I was to use constraints, okay, I would have to set from the top left and the second from the top left. But then what happens if I add a new one, or I change the text to have 2 lines, then suddenly the constraint for the third element is no longer relevant. So because of that, and in the design tool, you cannot set like a constraint between 2 elements. In Xcode, you can do that. But even if you do that, it also adds another level of complexity, like you do have to set like another level of constraints. So this one against this one against this one. But suddenly, let's say if you delete this element, then this one doesn't have any constraint anymore, and then it breaks your UI. So that's why constraints are not as friendly, and I would rather use auto layout as much as possible. So what happens to YouTube icons? It's only changed for iOS. I'm not sure. Is there any chance to work on a Flutter course? Flutter. So that's a good question. I really want to learn Flutter. I really want to design for Android, but at the same time, I know that Android is working on so many things, so many projects, and it already feels like Flutter is getting old, to be honest. And that might be just my opinion. Flutter has been around for like a year or 2 years already. Actually 2 years, because they came before SwiftUI. And also, once you go SwiftUI, it's extremely hard to enjoy Flutter. I challenge you to try that, because SwiftUI completely changed the way I see mobile development. So much so that when I go back to, like the old way of coding React Native or Flutter, I feel like it's so much more efficient to just do everything in SwiftUI. And because of this, it's not that I don't want to learn React Native or I don't want to learn Flutter. Because of this, I know that Google and is going to change. They're going to evolve it. And so when I know it's going to evolve very soon, I feel like maybe I should wait a little bit before teaching Flutter at the moment. And also because I have so many courses to teach, I'm still, like, we have the WWC, which is going to come in a month. And so because of all of these new platforms that are coming out, and to me that is so friendly that I feel like I'm starting to get so comfortable with, I feel like I don't want to learn another platform just yet. And someone also pointed out about Jetpack Compose, which sounds very interesting as well. What if this is the new SwiftUI and now I have to learn Jetpack Compose as well? So I'm waiting a little bit for the water to settle, and when I have a feeling that maybe, I don't know if Google is doing their new conference this year as well, and once they launch something that I feel like, okay, this is something that I really want to spend a lot of time on and that I feel very passionate about, then maybe I'll get into Flutter or Jetpack Compose. But at the time being, I think I'm going to focus on UI design course, on a new SwiftUI course when WWDC is going to come out. What is the name of this program? It's called Figma. Or if you're talking about DesignCode, it's designcode.io. Thank you for the comments on the visual style. I'm glad that you enjoy it. Can you share the link to this Figma project? It's not yet done. Also, it's not, I'm actually creating this live stream for the purpose of practicing for the UI design course, which is going to be condensed into a more digestible content and also more organized. But this live stream allows me to sort of speak to the audience and kind of get questions from you, have a feel of how I want to get people engaged in the new course, but also to design for my teams, because we are working on DesignCode 4. I like to work on real projects. I don't like to waste time creating fake projects, which is why I'm teaching something that is going to be launched in a couple months, hopefully. I don't want to put too much pressure on my team, but I also want to play with the new technologies on web. So React hooks, suspense, and there's like some new React animation tools that is coming out. There's 3GS that I might want to play with. There's Framer Web that I also might want to play with. So some of these new tools that I'm really, really excited to try, that I will be using in this course, in my UI design course, in an updated React web course that's going to use React hooks, that's going to use new CSS techniques, such as, there's so many new layout techniques in CSS that I want to explore as well, animations, transitions, and so on. So that's why this is where we are, and hopefully in a couple of weeks or in a month, I'm going to launch my UI design course. I'm going to share the Figma file, and you're going to be able to explore and also take the course with me, build your own design from those techniques. Hopefully, it's going to allow you to apply to your own product page, and we're going to be able to code together, to design together, and have fun with it. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this second stream. Hopefully you enjoy it, and feel free to send your requests, make these comments, and I'm going to try to do more live streams if people like it. And so have a great weekend, everyone. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.